There was a moment after the cameras flashed, after the applause rolled through the room, when Phil Collins stood beside Cher with an Oscar in his hand and looked like a man who had won everything. But that was only what the photograph showed. What it did not show was the small tremor in his fingers. It did not show the way he kept glancing down at the golden statue as if it belonged to someone else. It did not show the strange silence that can fall when the world says yes, and all he can hear is the echo of rooms where he once failed to be present. Cher noticed it first. She had been smiling for the photographers, one arm close to him, her black curls framing her face like something from another age of Hollywood. She knew how to live inside bright light. She knew what a camera wanted. She knew how the room could love you for 30 seconds and still leave you alone 5 minutes later. When the flashbulbs paused, she leaned closer and said quietly, "Phil, honey, are you all right?" Phil gave the public smile, the one people had seen for years, the easy grin from interviews, the cheeky face from Genesis television appearances, the smile that made people think nothing had ever cut him too deeply. "I'm fine," he said. Cher looked at the Oscar, then back at him. "That is not what I asked." For a second, no answer. Around them, the 2000 Academy Awards kept moving like a machine. Publicists crossed the hallway with clipboards. Nominees hugged families. Reporters whispered names. The music from Tarzan had just climbed out of an animated jungle and into Oscar history. "You'll Be in My Heart" had won Best Original Song. To the world, it was a clean Hollywood triumph. Disney song, big chorus, famous singer, golden statue. But Phil knew there was nothing clean about the road that had brought him there. He had been the drummer hidden behind Genesis when Peter Gabriel was the creature in costume at the front of the stage. He had survived the terrifying move from the drum stool to the microphone. He had turned heartbreak into face value. He had taken the private collapse of a marriage and somehow made millions of strangers feel less alone. He had lived in hotel rooms, dressing rooms, airports, studios, and houses that sometimes felt too quiet when he finally came home. And then, almost unbelievably, one of the most intimate promises he had ever sung was not born in a divorce room or a rock studio. It was born for an animated film about a child left in a world that did not know how to hold him. That was the part people missed. "You'll Be in My Heart" sounded like comfort. But comfort is not cheap when it comes from a man who knows what absence costs. Phil looked down at the Oscar again. "I think," he said, "I just won something I was afraid to want." Cher's expression softened. For all the glitter around her, there was nothing silly in her face now. She had also known public love, public judgment, public resurrection. She had been laughed at, adored, dismissed, rediscovered, and crowned again. She understood how applause could feel like both a rescue and a reminder. "Afraid to want it?" she asked. Phil let out a small breath. "Because when you want something this badly, you find out what it says about you." And that was the secret of that night. The Oscar was not just an award. It was a mirror. It showed Phil Collins, the father, the workaholic, the survivor, the man who had spent years singing about love while trying to understand what love demanded when the stage lights went out. He had spent a lifetime writing songs for rooms he could not stay in. That was the line no one heard in the noise of the party, but it was there, hanging quietly between Phil and Cher in that backstage hallway, while the cameras waited for one more smile. Earlier that evening, before the envelope was opened, Phil had tried to act as if he was relaxed. He knew how to do that. He had been pretending to be relaxed since the 70s. Back then, he was just the drummer, the man with the sharp ears and the comic timing, the one who could hold the band together while the rest of the world stared at Peter Gabriel. Then Peter left. Then Genesis needed a singer. Then the drummer became the voice. And suddenly, every night felt like a test he had not asked to take. That pressure never completely left him. Even at the Oscars, dressed for Hollywood, surrounded by stars, he could still feel the old question behind his ribs. Are you enough? Are you really the one they meant to choose? Or did you simply survive long enough for the room to run out of alternatives? Before the ceremony, someone in the hallway had slapped him on the shoulder and said, "It's a sweet song, Phil. Maybe too sweet for Oscar." He had smiled. He always smiled, but the words followed him. Too sweet, too soft, too simple. As if a father promising a child that love would not disappear was simple. As if the promise itself did not carry every night he had missed, every family dinner interrupted by work, every phone call from another time zone, every suitcase packed while a child watched from a doorway. What the fans did not know was that Phil had never written comfort from a place of comfort. He wrote it like a man trying to learn it. He wrote it like a man who knew how easily a home could turn into an empty hallway. That was why You'll Be in My Heart had reached people who had never cared about Oscars. Parents heard it and thought of children. Children heard it and thought of safety. Older men heard it and felt something they did not know how to say. Women heard it and recognized the ache of someone promising more than life sometimes lets him keep. But that night, Phil was not thinking about sales or charts. He was thinking about a line from the song that had followed him all day. No matter what they say, no matter what they say. It sounded brave when sung over music. It felt much harder in real life. At one point before the award, Cher crossed paths with him near a side corridor. She had the kind of presence that could fill a room without raising her voice. Phil, who had met every kind of famous person by then, still found himself slightly disarmed by her. "You look like you're waiting for a doctor, not an Oscar," she said. He laughed, because that was easier than telling the truth. "Maybe both can be dangerous." Cher tilted her head. "You wrote that song for a movie, but you don't look like a man thinking about a movie." Phil looked toward the stage entrance, where warm light spilled across the floor. "I suppose songs do that, don't they? You think you're writing for one story, and then your own life walks in through the back door." Cher's voice dropped. "Then let it in. People can tell when you don't." It was a small conversation, the kind that would never make the broadcast. But sometimes a small conversation carries more truth than the speech everyone remembers. Phil thought of Genesis. He thought of the first time he had sung lead because someone had to. He thought of the lonely machine pulse of the Roland CR-78 during the face value years. He thought of sitting with a drum pattern while his life came apart, making a sound that felt like a heartbeat in an empty house. Back then, pain had made him famous in a new way. This time, tenderness had brought him to the same edge. And that frightened him more than anger ever had. Anger could be dramatic. Heartbreak could be loud. But tenderness left a man exposed. Tenderness said, "This is what I wish I had protected. This is what I still want to protect. This is the part of me fame never fixed." When the category finally came, Phil sat very still. The room glittered. The envelope waited. A few seats away, someone whispered. The nominees were read. His face appeared in the rhythm of the ceremony. He could feel the polite smile on his own mouth, the one all nominees wear because losing must also look graceful. Then the title was spoken. "You'll be in my heart." For a fraction of a second, Phil did not move. The body sometimes receives joy like bad news. It freezes first. It tries to understand whether the thing is real. Then the room rose around him. When Phil Collins walked to the stage, the distance was not long, but it carried decades. It carried the young drummer who thought he would spend his life behind cymbals. It carried the frightened new frontman who had to stand where Peter Gabriel once stood. It carried the divorced man alone with machines and piano chords. It carried the father who knew that love was not only something you sang, it was something you had to show up for, and sometimes he had not known how. That is why his Oscar speech, no matter how brief or polished it may have sounded to the room, could never hold the whole story. Award speeches are made for seconds. Regret takes years. By the time he came backstage, the cameras were hungry for happiness. They wanted the neat ending. Phil Collins wins. Cher smiles beside him. The song from Tarzan becomes the anthem of the night. And yes, it was happiness. But it was not only happiness. That is what made the moment powerful. Phil was not a young man grabbing his first dream. He was a man old enough to know that dreams do not return what time has taken. An Oscar could not give back missed mornings. It could not put him at every bedside. It could not turn every apology into an embrace. It could not make a public victory solve a private ache. Cher seemed to understand that without being told. When they stood together for the photographs, she let the room have its picture. She smiled with that enormous old Hollywood confidence. Phil held the Oscar and smiled too, but his eyes still looked slightly surprised, as if he had wandered into someone else's good fortune. After the flashes, she touched his arm and said, "Listen to me. Don't make this smaller than it is." Phil looked at her. "It's a song for a cartoon ape man, Cher." She gave him a look sharp enough to cut through the joke. "No. It's a song for every child who needed someone to stay. And maybe for every parent who knows they didn't always manage it. That's not small." The words landed harder than applause. For once, Phil had no quick answer, no joke, no deflection, no drum fill to get him into the next bar. He only nodded. That was the strange beauty of "You'll Be in My Heart." It did not need to be complicated to be deep. In fact, its simplicity was the wound. It said the thing people spend entire lives trying to prove. I am here. I will stay with you. You are not alone. And coming from Phil Collins, that promise carried history. It carried the man who had played through exhaustion because the band depended on him. It carried the performer who looked cheerful on television while private chapters were breaking behind the curtain. It carried the father who knew that a loving heart and a demanding career can sometimes pull in opposite directions until both begin to hurt. That night at the Oscars, standing beside Cher, he was not just receiving approval from Hollywood. He was hearing the world embrace the gentlest part of him. That may be why the photograph still feels alive. Look at it long enough, and you can see more than celebration. You can see surprise. You can see relief. You can see two survivors of fame standing under a bright, merciless light, both knowing that applause is wonderful, but it never tells the whole truth. Years later, people would remember the song as warm, safe, almost inevitable. They would play it at weddings, at memorials, in living rooms, in cars, in quiet moments between parents and children. They would forget the industry doubts. They would forget the competition. They would forget the exact order of the ceremony. But they would not forget the feeling. A voice says, "You will be in my heart." And somewhere, someone believes it for 3.5 minutes. That is what Phil won that night. Not only an Oscar, not only another trophy in a career already crowded with them. He won proof that tenderness could survive the noise. He won proof that a lullaby could stand in the same room as power and still be the strongest thing there. He had spent a lifetime writing songs for rooms he could not stay in. But for one brief night in Hollywood, the room stayed with him. And maybe that is why, in that famous photograph with Cher, Phil Collins does not only look like a winner, he looks like a man finally hearing his own promise come back to him. If stories like this remind you why Phil Collins' music still matters, subscribe for more untold stories from the legends who gave everything to the music.